I actually enjoyed maths and art a lot, and I'd love to say that I had a great calling, but it was actually something whereby when I came to go to university, I was looking at doing quite a broad range of subjects, but actually it sort of brought together the maths and art component from my A-levels. So no great romantic story, I'm afraid. But when I got to university, I loved it from day one, so I knew it was the right decision.
So as a child then, you weren't someone who'd sort of walk around looking up at all the buildings?
I did love Lego, and I
There you
used
go.
to rearrange my room probably an annoyingly large amount of times a week. But I don't know if that's a sign that you're destined to be an architect.
Well, you did go off to obviously study architecture, and you were extremely successful as a student, and then of course worked on some very, very high profile and multi-award winning projects like the Peckham Library, for instance. What do you have to do to make a library in Peckham an award winning building?
It's an interesting one because it came at a time, it was actually in sort of late 90s and it was a recession. I was actually very lucky to get a placement and it was in my year out. But it was an unusual commission really in that the architect that I was working for was quite avant-garde, and so to do a sort of public building in a location where, you know, the community at the Peckham at the time was quite sort of low socio-economic group, was quite risque, but it was immediately really popular. Also became a bit of a landmark, so put Peckham on the map in many respects. Popular both in terms of the press and the people, which is usually not very likely to happen.
And with something like that, obviously, as you said, it's a public building. It also has a very specific practical use too. So with that sort of project, do you begin by thinking about the inside or the outside of the building?
Well, what used to happen was that Will would begin by putting some paint onto paper and sort of using his hairdryer to blow it around a bit. And then he'd pass it down to us and ask us to make it into a building. And was very much sort of disregard for whether it was the inside or the outside. And I remember one of my jobs was to do what we call the pods on the interior. And they were sort of round, almost blob-like spaces that were inside the library, and sort of double curvature, quite hard to make, and really hard to put shelves up in, which we discovered, which is a bit of a downside. But again, very popular. You know, really nice spaces. The kids loved them. It became very different from your standard library environment. But conceptually, there it was, very broad brush approach. And it was very much, as somebody who's sort of working on the shop floor of the company at the time, it was my job to realise a abstract painting, really.
It's interesting, though, that approach of being, as you described it, sort of quite avant-garde, because it's a real risk, isn't it? You have to be very brave to do that because, as you know, some very famous buildings have sort of illustrated over the years, you are either going to have a lot of people love it or a lot of people hate it.
That is true, but also it's for at least one person, if not, in this case, sort of publicly funded, you're talking about a lot of money. And it's a big gamble if it's not successful, both sort of from an architectural feasibility point of view in that it doesn't function, but also if it's not popular. And at that time, it was a sort of like mid-90s recession. So it was deemed a significant amount of money. So it was great that it was popular.
It is good. And of course, you co-founded Assemblage as well. So what was your goal then with creating the studio?
Well, I had been working for some time and had enjoyed it, but really liked some commissions more than others, in that I had done quite a lot of high-end residential work. And whereas that's enjoyable on one level, it didn't really feel like I was contributing to sort of society at large, often doing sort of work for, say, one individual or in some cases sort of holiday homes for individuals that they might use sort of once a year for a month. And that's actually probably not the reason I sort of enjoyed architecture, so I wanted to contribute. So we tried to aim at work that would have a sort of broader brush contribution in terms of the global market, but also in terms of the sort of public people who, in addition to those who have lots of money. So in a way, that was behind it. And it hasn't always been the case. I mean, we've had to, as most businesses do, take often what commissions came along at a time if we didn't have a lot of work on. But we always tried to make time to do the less well-funded but more sort of meaningful work within the company.
And you have done such a huge variety. I mean, have only mentioned one of them now so far, the Peckham Library, but to go from something like that to working on regeneration schemes and in, for instance, the Holy City in Iraq as well. I mean, what a massive undertaking, and to have to be presumably very sensitive to the culture in somewhere like that as well.
Yeah, that's actually been quite difficult. I mean, before we took on the work in Iraq, and this is sort of as a consequence we were asked to do it, we actually did work in about 25 or so different boroughs and districts around the UK. But even within those districts, you have certain populace would be, a majority sort of Bangladeshi or majority sort of Muslim, or even, different sort of community groups, some seaside towns. We had, the demographic were a lot older, and obviously I was young at the time, so you were often having to design for people who were very different from yourself. And some people find that quite daunting, and some people actually ignore it and just design for themselves, which is always a mistake in my view. But it's part of the research, and we've always straddled design and research. So it's part of the research cycle is to learn as much as you can about the potential user group, whatever their differences from your own, and build on that in terms of the design. But it often, it just makes it richer, both as a process for me to work on it, but also the end result is often more successful. To understand the importance of what you add and also what's there already is really key. It's not. I remember being told very early on in my career that surgeons bury their mistakes, but architects live with theirs, and it's very, very true. So I think it is really important to be aware of what the significance of what you're doing and the permanence of what you're doing, and also to understand how things age and how things, need to change as they become older and other things grow and change around them, and not just, sort of treat everything as a one-off landmark, because sometimes you can assume what the user group is because you deem them to be like yourself, and actually you get it wrong because you haven't put the research in anyway.
And you're also, though, looking at your projects, you seem very sensitive and sympathetic to the environment as well. I mean, I'm thinking of, for instance, the Dirt Cove House in Clonakilty, for instance, and looking at that particular building. It's so beautiful and fits in so well to that sort of area. Eco buildings as well, which, again, sort of very sympathetic to the environment. And I wonder how many of your clients you find are sort of taking an interest in that approach, or is it still sort of a bit of a battle when it comes to that?
I think what really makes a difference is legislation, because if you have a client who has to meet certain legislation, they will. And often if it's inexpensive to go over and above that sort of standard that's drawn, then they will happily be persuaded. But if you're actually talking about significant amounts of money, whether it be in loss of deliverables or actual construction cost, it is actually still hard to persuade somebody to go over and above what the law requires them. So the big thing that we try and push, not necessarily through our work, but through our connections in the architectural world, is actually to push for increase in legislation. And you find in other countries such as Germany that they have much more stringent legislation, and as a result they have significantly lower energy usage. But it is, when you have a client who's of course counting their pennies, to ask them to spend extra on anything is difficult. But if, as I say, they have to because of legislation, and if everybody has to, then the products themselves become cheaper, the construction becomes cheaper because it's more readily available. So it's really it's harder to do it through the client, and we shouldn't really be doing it through the client. We should be doing it through the government.
It sounds like it must be quite exhausting and quite frustrating at times, dealing with all these sort of different areas.
Oh, it's incredibly, like, as a job, it's like juggling constantly and sort of gasping for oxygen. And in some ways that's terrible. And people often say, with your children, would you like them to be architects? And I sort of think, God, no. But I enjoy it. But then I think maybe I'm a sort of particularly unusual and weird type of person. I don't know.
I'm intrigued as well, going back to your work in Iraq. Did you encounter any sort of challenges or prejudices as a woman working out there? Again, I'm just thinking about the difference in culture. I
have done, but then to be honest, I have done in the UK too. It's very easy for people to sort of say, oh, it must be terribly corrupt, or people must be very sexist, because they have these predetermined views about sort of Middle East. But actually, you do encroach upon the same territory in your own hometown, so I wouldn't necessarily be particularly stereotyping there. I mean, we have had problems because we're not Muslim, and a lot of the people, or Iraqi, and a lot of people actually have said that for us to design, as well as doing the parliament, we did UN housing settlements, and at times we're in a situation where we need to design mosques, and obviously it's an enormous learning curve for us to do that. And people were sceptical, but actually in terms of the end result, they were very happy. But you have to face that scepticism initially.
You mentioned, obviously, that you do have encountered some sort of prejudice as a woman in the UK as well. And I wonder, with regards to the industry itself, with the architecture industry, because you were highly commended in the Women in Architecture Awards, but what is the gender split then in the architecture world like?
It's in teaching, the majority are now females. But as you go higher in terms of the employment world, the percentage is very low. I couldn't tell you exactly what it is, but it's always quite frighteningly low. It's not a job that lends itself particularly well to having part-time positions. Say, for example, if something's on site, the builder will want you there whenever he's on site, or he or she's on site. And therefore, it is quite hard for women who have children to take a part-time role, and you often find that women do therefore leave the profession as a result. I've worked with a lot of women who are more junior than me, but very few women who are more senior than me.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I suppose it's a shame, because I would have thought that as women we would obviously add something a little different to the industry itself, because we'd have a slightly different perspective on whether it's the artistic side or the socioeconomic side. We would potentially have quite a lot to offer.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of really talented women leave the profession, and I think sometimes the question is why the men stay. I don't know if that's the bigger question. But it's a shame that there is not more done to accommodate women in architectural practice. But at the moment, it isn't happening. And when it does happen, it's usually through a female or a mixed company. And therefore, it does come across as quite a misogynist world, which again sort of proliferates the problem.
And so tell us a little bit then about the master's course that you're leading, and what would you hope students take away from that?
Well, it's a really interesting course. It's actually one of the first of its kind, in that, as well as dealing with architecture, I mean, I've previously taught on an urban design course and on architecture courses, but this one actually very much combines the two, and it's about context and responding to context, which is great, because in the work that we do as a practice, we don't sort of delineate between size. It's always response to whatever's needed, and that will be scaled up accordingly. But it's really nice to teach in that environment too. And we've got this is only the second year it's running at UCL, and we've got 17 students that come from 10 different countries and 4 different continents, and it's a very mixed bunch, and they have a lot of different backgrounds, mostly architectural, but some have been working for some time, and some are newly graduating from their degrees. But they all are very engaged in the idea of looking at this historical context. And they're all new to London. There's no London people in the group. So it's been an amazing journey just this year to go on with them, to sort of see London through their eyes and teach them about London, because we've been based in London this year. But I mean, I like to think that it's about opening your eyes as a designer, but not only to the potential of what could be there, but what is there already.
And with regards to the design side of things, I suppose as an architect and designing buildings, obviously you have a direct impact on the space around people, don't you, with the buildings that you are designing and constructing. So would you say that it is sort of crucial to have the sort of attitude that you are representing here in a way, about sort of contributing to society? And I know that it mentions in your bio this idea of considerate architecture. Do you think that's sort of a crucial element now to being an architecture today?
I think it is. I think, unfortunately, it's been an art that has followed fashion, but it's it's very permanent things that we're making, and they live alongside similarly important period constructions of a different age, and to actually to understand the importance of what you add and also what's there already is really key. It's not. I remember being told very early on in my career that surgeons bury their mistakes, but architects live with theirs, and it's very, very true. So I think it is really important to be aware of what the significance of what you're doing and the permanence of what you're doing, and also to understand how things age and how things need to change as they become older and other things grow and change around them, and not just sort of treat everything as a one-off landmark.
Wonderful. Okay, a couple of fun questions then to end. What building would you say, it can be new or old, what building that you haven't worked on would you say you'd like to be able to tell people was actually yours?
Oh, pretty much anything by Peter Zumthor, I would definitely say was mine. But he's alive, so he can dispute me, so that's not so good.
And are there any in particular that when you see them, they just really make your skin crawl and you just really dislike them?
Oh, unfortunately, there's too many of those. I actually, from working in the Middle East, if I see anything that's in an environment that gets to sort of 50 degrees and is entirely made out of glass, that can set me off, because it's nearly always pumping away with its air conditioning, because it's not fit for its environment. But yeah, that happens a lot.
What do you make of buildings like, for instance, the Gherkin in London? Because it's really prominent, isn't it? But it does sort of get lauded for different reasons. But I'm just curious as to what you make of it.
It does. I actually I don't mind the Gherkin. I don't like the walkie-talkie, and the Shard only works from about the fourth floor up. But I think there's been quite a kickback in London about high-rises, and we're actually working in the Greenwich Peninsula at the moment, so it's coming up a lot. But I think that London can carry significant buildings in terms of height, and I think they just need to be done, designed well.
If there's someone that is listening who is thinking they would really like to get into architecture, what sort of advice would you give them?
I did a little bit of work experience before I went to university, and that helped me a lot, because I think the university education is very long, and if the first time you go into an office is only after you've done 5 years, it can be a shock to your system if you then don't like it. So I'd get some work experience first to make sure that the commitment that you're taking on is something that you want to do.
And obviously you did spend quite a bit of time on the Isle of Man, so I'm curious as to what you make of the mix of architecture over here.
The thing I love about it is that it's got breathing space. And some of the work that I've done, say, in Cork, we've never actually done a building in the Isle of Man, unfortunately, but some of the work I've done in Cork, you can respond with your architecture to the landscape so much because you have this breathing space around you. And in London, everything's crammed together like sardines in terms of the architecture. And whenever I go to the Isle of Man, I just think actually it's an architect's dream to work there, because it's got so many amazing sites and incredible sort of environments to work in, and there's a significant amount of space in order to build something that actually did respond to the environment.
So do you think there's a chance in the future you might come over here and build something?
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah, I'd love to. Any excuse.
So anyone that's listening, let's get a commission right now.